This month is always special because of two great Unitarians who were born in February. Charles Dickens on the 7th in 1812 and Charles Darwin 3 years earlier on February 12th in 1809. You may all recall the big celebration to mark the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And the Dickens bicentennial inaugurated a new cinematic production of Great Expectations, the publication of 2 new biographies, and an exhibition called Charles Dickens at 200 at the Morgan Library in New York City, which boasts the largest private collection of Dickens papers in the U.S., including the manuscript of A Christmas Carol. There are also many other exhibits and festivals in London and in Portsmouth, a coastal city of Dickens' birth. His great-great-grandson Mark presented a reading of The Christmas Carol. It was an opportunity for creative celebration, and in 2012, Reverend Gaye created a dialogue between Darwin's and Dickens in a service for the Aiken UU Church. It has been adapted for our service today as a reflection on how the towering personalities of Dickens and Darwin were shaped by some common elements. These two men, whose achievements have shaped Western culture, lived as contemporaries, though there is no evidence that they actually ever met. We do know that Dickens was impressed with Darwin's work, but these two might have had a lot more in common than we might think. So this morning, we present a purely speculative conversation that is a fictional creation. Remember, there is such a thing as poetic license. It might have occurred on the streets of London when one CD bumped into the other CD. Maybe as they were strolling through Bloomsbury, where Dickens and his wife Catherine once lived and where they raised 10 children. Or perhaps Darwin would have been visiting London, traveling from his home in rural Bromley a few miles away to see his brother Erasmus, who lived near Cavendish Square. Imagine that after exchanging their howdy-do's and comments about the weather, these two elderly men saunter over to a nearby park bench and begin to tell each other stories about their early childhood years. Randy Raymond is our Darwin, and Joseph Zuchowski reads the part of Dickens.
Natural selection. That is a fascinating idea, Mr. Darwin. You know, I can't help but think that my life might have taken a different turn if I had not been to bear the burden of my family's death before I was 13. You see, my father was the legitimate son of an aristocrat. He was a man who enjoyed life beyond his means, a quality of which my mother learned only after they were married. I was the second of 5 children, and I was sickly, but entertained. I was always singing comic songs, writing and acting character sketches. My father recognized there was something special about me and sent me off to grammar school, where I excelled. Within 2 years, my spendthrift father was sent off to debtor's prison, and all of the family, except for me, went with him. I lived in lodgings away from my family, and I was forced to work long hours in a bootblack factory. I glued the labels onto the pots. I was alone in a world of adults, not sure if I could trust any of them. You see, after my father got out, and it's also turned out, I learned not to trust my own mother. You see, after my father got out of prison, and released me from my work in the factory, my mother suggested that I go back there and continue to earn money for the family, even though my father refused to consider it. I never afterwards forgot. I shall never forget. Indeed, I never can forget that my mother wanted me sent back there. In my more introspective moments, I know the plucky orphans in my stories are born from the experiences in that factory.
Fortunately, Mr. Dickens, my childhood was quite different, quite comfortable. My father built a house in Shrewsbury in the early years of marriage to my mother. He was a physician and did quite well. My mother belonged to the Wedgwood family, and so our family lived comfortably. I was the fourth of 5 children. My mother was in charge of the children, the house, and the finances, while my father tended to the patients. My mother died when I was 8, and my older sisters took over running the household while my father devoted even more of his time to his work. I was sent to a boarding school soon after called the Mount, and his curriculum was almost exclusively given over to the classics, which to me were quite useless. Although my father became quite worried that I had not inherited the intelligence of the Darwin family, I soon began conducting scientific experiments in the shed over the back of our house with my brother Erasmus, and continued to do so until he went off to Cambridge to study medicine. I became fascinated with collecting minerals and insects, and with bird watching. I became very fond of hunting, especially when I went off to study at Edinburgh. So much so that my father feared that I would become an idle hunting man. My father and grandfather both had studied at Edinburgh, and I was 16. And when I was 16, I was told it was time to make something of myself.
Just as you began your experiments with university education, I left school to work at a solicitors club, and I taught myself shorthand. My uncle, who owned a weekly newspaper, hired me to transcribe court proceedings and parliamentary debates. But I also wrote fiction under the pen name of Boz, and soon had a contract for my first novel. When the Pickwick Papers were published in April of 1836, the print was for 40,000, and by that November, I had quit the newspaper to become a full-time novelist. 5 years later, after All the Twist and Nicholas Nickleby were published, I was the most famous man in England.
Yes, I've even heard of that.
My character Nell in the old curiosity shop was based upon my beloved sister-in-law Mary, who collapsed and died at her home in 1837. In the book, Nell's illness and death elicited a storm of emotion from my readers. It is said that the Irish fellow, MP Daniel O'Connell, reading the book whilst in a railway carriage, burst into tears, groaning he should never have killed her, and threw the book out the tram window. My aim was to use the popularity of my novels to make as much money as possible with my writings, so that I would not be with the same fate as my father. Oh, my dear friend Walter Scott, who at one point lost all of his money. Despite my financial successes, my contentment was not complete because of the iniquities I saw in our society. I was a very lucky young man, but my history taught me that I needed to do more to help my more unfortunate fellow human beings.
I consider myself to have been lucky as well, my friend. I have always had the ability to act upon chance opportunities in life. One of those was when I completed my undergraduate study at Cambridge, and I left for a voyage with Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle. As you know, the research that I did, the mentors that I met, and just generally making the best of a bad situation in terms of my health, have all resulted in my views and theory on chance variations and natural selection. Although my intention was only to write to my family and never to publish this as an academic exercise, there is a little known impetus that I have had, just as you have in your charitable zeal, and that is my fight against slavery. As you may know, my Aunt Sarah gave more money than any other female donor to the anti-slavery cause. In fact, the Darwins and Wedgwoods helped to fund and distribute large numbers of copies of anti-slavery literature. My first encounter with a slave was while I was a student at Edinburgh University. I was taught taxidermy by a Guyanese slave. I used often to sit with him, for he was a very pleasant and intelligent man. His name was John Edmonston, and he confirmed my own belief that black and white people possess the same humanity. My abhorrence of slavery increased on the Beagle voyage. Whilst in Rio, I witnessed slaves landing on the beach and saw for myself the thumb screws that were used by slave owners to punish female slaves. And while staying there, I saw a young household mulatto constantly reviled, beaten, and persecuted enough to break the spirit of the fiercest animal. I will not even allude to the many heart-sickening atrocities of which I heard, but these deeds are done by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves, who believe in God and pray that His will be done on earth. It makes one's blood boil, and yet one's heart tremble to think we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty.
Speaking of America, at the height of my fame, I traveled with Catherine, my wife, to see America. Oh, a bit of a sidetrack. How did you find America? And I said, quite honestly, madam, I did not. That was the navigator's responsibility. Came with such anticipation to see for myself what I regarded as the new Eden. I found nothing but disappointment and disgust at the American way of life. I found a place where privacy and personal liberties were much eroded. I did not hesitate to say so. I had ample opportunity to express my opinions on the subject of slavery whilst touring the South. I dealt roundly with it as a certain judge in St. Louis. I said I was very averse to speaking on the subject. But when he said that he pities our national ignorance of truth of slavery, I told him that men who spoke of it as a blessing, as a state of things to be desired, were out of pale reason. For them to speak of British ignorance or prejudice was as absurdly so and too ridiculous to be combated. I wrote to my friend Mr. Macready that this was neither the republic I came to see nor the republic of my imagination, and everything of which it has been made a boast, excepting the education of the people and its care for the poor children. It seems immeasurably below the level I had placed upon it.
Never in 5 years on my travels was I able to escape slavery. Once I returned to London, Emma and I joined a radical abolitionist circle of family and friends, and I must admit that this group had its discussions influenced my scientific thinking on the unity of the races. The leading pluralist theories of race in the 1850s were used, as you know, to justify slavery. However, my idea of a branching common descent, if you can conjure up an image of a tree, unites all the races, plant, human, and animal alike. And just as slave-making in ant colonies is an odious instinct, so too is the great sin of slavery in our society.
I know of your family's sterling work in the anti-slavery movement, and I am well aware that Unitarians, like your family, were involved long before the most famous Anglican saints like Wilberforce began speaking against it in Parliament. I myself was born into the Anglican home and was baptized into that faith. But I became a Unitarian in my 30s. I felt the Anglican Church was at its own throat because of doctrinal wranglings of various parties. More popery here, more Methodism there. Just different forms of consignment to eternal damnation. So being disgusted with the established church, I carried into effect an old idea of mine and joined Unitarians who would do something for the human improvement, and Unitarians practice charity and toleration. I deplore emotionalism, ignorance, and lack of cultivation of those non-Unitarian clergy whose fulminate against me. And even more so, I object to the missionaries who make themselves perfect nuisances and who leave every place worse than when they found it.
When I was a young man, I thought seriously about becoming a clergyman. And I thought of myself as a Christian. When I went aboard the Beagle, I thought of myself as a Christian when I went aboard the Beagle. But over the years, disbelief has crept over me at a very slow rate until at last it was complete. I have believed that the degree of evil and suffering in the world throws doubt upon the idea of an omnipotent and loving deity. We might well be unique with consciousness and our ability to reason, but this uniqueness evolved, not having been bestowed upon us by a divine creator. I know that within the Unitarian movement in America, both Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau have accepted my theory. My ideas foster a deeper, nature-centered spirituality, rather than focusing on the supernatural. It evokes wonder and awe because of the amazing diversity and fecundity of this natural world. There is grandeur in this view of life. a larger meaning, and a broader ethic.
It seems, my friend, that we have much in common in the way in which we coped determinedly with our childhood hardships, the way our youthful experiences helped to shape our curiosity of the world and its inhabitants.
Yes, and certainly our desire to show our love and concern for each other as human beings, and a sense of solidarity in fighting the evils of slavery, which diminishes the humanity in all of us.
And an abiding appreciation for the fullness of the Unitarian faith that calls us to a higher vision of these people connected with the sacred in life. May it truly be said, as my character Tiny Tim observed, God bless us all, everyone.
Charles Dickens died in 1870. Charles Dickens died in June 1870. Darwin died in April 1882. It may seem that it is rare for scientists and literary authors to cross paths. A scientist often spends many hours within the four walls of a laboratory, while many authors never set foot in a laboratory their entire lives. As a result, they generally don't talk to each other. However, Priya Venkatesan argues in a 2007 article in The Scientist that they do talk to each other, albeit indirectly. Scientists are indeed influenced by literary and humanistic discourses, and scientific principles are reflected in literary work. This article argues that Dickens appropriated many of the elements of evolutionary theory into his work. The possibility that creation is through natural order, rather than through the unknown, permeates such novels as Bleak House. Whatever the truth of intertextuality, I hope that artistic license, as seen in the meetings of minds we have witnessed here today, has served to lift up our eternal gratitude for the tireless and timeless genius demonstrated by these two Unitarian saints who have gone before us. And now, your curtain calls.